real challenges and pain points, I think, that we've been living and experiencing as well. Just as real estate professionals, the real estate space generally has been hit pretty hard.
Inflation dropped below 2%, both on, I think, general CPI and PCE. The housing market nationally slowly resetting and normalizing. We've been in a very abnormal situation since COVID.
The average time that people have to save to buy for their first time home purchase is like 7 years.
Episode 71 of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff, two uninteresting guys talking about interesting times. Jeff, here we are, the very last episode of 2025. How has your New Year holiday been?
Good so far, Mark. It's nothing to complain about, not a whole lot to report on. It is the last day of the year, and so I saw somebody had posted a funny meme, I think, on an internal messaging channel that said, "I haven't decided what I'm going to wear to the New Year's Eve party in the family room yet. I might not go," or something to that effect. And I typically go to bed early, I get up early, and so my kids, my family always give me a hard time, like if I can make it to the New Year staying awake or not. And as silly as it sounds, man, there have been some years where it's actually been a pretty painful effort to try to force myself to get out of that natural sleep rhythm that I've been in, but others it hasn't been as bad. But good so far. How about you? Anything exciting to report on your end?
Supporting my wife doing exciting things, I guess, is kind of all I can admit to at this point. She's running in it's kind of a team ultra marathon thing called Snowdrop here in Southwest Houston. It's like 55 hours of continuous running by the team. I think she's trying to get 50 miles run in those 2.5 days. So she's out doing that and running at midnight tonight, I think, at the place. So kind of we're trying to support her doing that, and kids are just excited to be on holiday. It was the end of the year here, and I've kind of run through some medical tests I was telling you about. I don't have the results yet, but I did do the calcium CT scan, which is just a CT imaging scan of your cardiovascular system or torso, heart specifically, looking for plaque. The guys we listen to a lot on in our podcast rounds here talk a lot about it, and it was like $125 and took literally 5 minutes.
Wow.
So kind of cool. I don't have the results yet, but I did it after I got some other screenings that I just always had high cholesterol. So it's like, I might as well. I'm not too worried about that, but might as well check it a little further with what our good friends online say we should be doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and actually is a good idea. I think you're inspiring me to do the same thing. It's interesting when you have the opportunity to just do some of that sort of thing that isn't terribly expensive, but you might not think about or just do otherwise, can make a huge difference. Now, the one thing I'm going to request is that next year you do the scan again if you hold well to this meat eating diet. I'm curious what the impact on the cholesterol is, but it seems that it hasn't had a negative impact when you've kind of gone that diet, right?
Well, it does make my cholesterol enormously high, and I think that concerns most reasonable people. Mine's always been high. It doesn't concern me. There's like a HDL divided by triglycerides or something that is really, really low. Athlete level low, as the metrics would say, and so like I think that's a little bit better indication of heart health than overall cholesterol. I don't know. I'm making life and death decisions on my amateur armchair medical knowledge. But so anyway, we'll see how it goes. But I mean, literally, I laid on this table. I didn't even have to take my shirt off at all. They put a couple monitors on me. I didn't have to take my phone out of my pocket. I mean, it was just that uninvasive. 2 cameras sort of spin around you real fast, I guess, and put this imaging together. So like really uninvasive. So it was easy to do. And my understanding is you kind of either have plaque buildup or you don't. And if you do, now there's some decisions that you can make. Maybe it's not very meaningful amount or whatever. You just monitor it or make other decisions. I don't know. So we'll see. It was very uninvasive. Certainly would recommend that. I'm 47, Jeff. So other checks like colonoscopy I've not done. I will be doing, and I'll I'll give undetailed reports of those things in 2026.
Yeah, I don't know how much detail I could stomach on that, Mark, but it's just, all of these things it's amazing what can be done, and to kind of get out ahead of, are there issues or not? If there's not, then, there's the comfort in that. If there are, then at least, like you say, you've got decisions to make, but you can start to make more proactive decisions on what you do. So that's awesome. I may be following suit, and not looking forward to some of the other, the colonoscopy, unfortunately, tends to be fairly invasive by definition. So good luck with that. I think I'm due as well coming up. So a fun time.
I don't know if I'm getting spooked by, the internet finding something wrong with everything, but I've been reading about some like unspoken about downsides of colonoscopy. And I'm sure this is ridiculous, and I hate even putting any hesitation, because everybody talks about being so useful to get out in front of all this stuff. But I've just read that. I was very surprised that there was anything negative. I shouldn't have been, I guess, but I've read a little bit of it now that I'm considering more. So I'll let you know what I find, of course, in terms of the research and all. But looking through that and trying to see where we are. Jeff, as we are in the last episode recording of the year here, a very happy new year to the listeners. I would kindly request, as you and I are thinking about the format of the show, we have peaks and troughs of momentum with what we're doing here, but and so we are constantly thinking about tweaks with what we're doing. And if anybody's got any feedback one way or another, comments or personally, we'd be all ears. So just shorter, more guests, different type of guests, different type of topics discussed. All of those things, we're wide open to as we keep this going.
I'm glad you're bringing that up at this point and not at the very end as we're wrapping things up. Maybe get more ears hearing that. But I do appreciate that, and definitely echo. I mean, it's been encouraging to get some of the feedback from people in unexpected places. Hey, listen to the podcast, enjoy it, that sort of thing. But it really is helpful. We were talking beforehand, that we enjoy doing this. We're planning to, continue to do this, but at the same time, we want to be reaching people and providing, something that's valuable and insightful. So, even if it's in the camp of constructive, criticism or something, things you don't like as well as things you do or would like to see more of a focus on, echo that. So your sentiment, Mark. It helps us to know what matters and what's, reaching people's interests and at what point people start to tune out. Probably at the colonoscopy talk is about when they start to tune out, Mark. So we might already be talking to nobody at this point, but so be it if that's the case.
I'm emphasize it, please, if you have feedback along those lines. But I think the message is pretty clear that an hour a week of interest rate talk is probably a little hard to stomach. So we're certainly working through that right now. It's crazy how much that's been in the headlines, and including a little bit in this podcast as we're talking, and we're concluding this year. Maybe next episode we'll get into some of our predictions mid-year and how we ended up. But it's certainly been tough for the real estate professionals. I think I saw 7 in 10 real estate agents maybe didn't sell or weren't part of a transaction at all in 2025. And I think that's a pretty good microcosm, Jeff. But I found this headline from the Babylon Bee satirical newsletter, whatever it is. I think puts things a little bit into perspective with their sarcasm. The headline reads, "Wow, what a terrible year. Say people living at the absolute peak of human civilization." All things in perspective, Jeff.
Boy, no doubt about that, Mark. And we've talked, pretty extensively because it's an interest of the evolving artificial intelligence landscape, the promise of productivity, of abundance, of all of those sorts of things. And yet there are, real challenges and pain points, I think, that we've been living and experiencing as well. Just as real estate professionals, the real estate space generally has been hit pretty hard. The interest rates, go up dramatically in 2023 and just really pumps the brakes, has this lock-in effect. Like, it's been challenging. There are other industries that are really ripping as far as, stock market prices, in artificial intelligence, tech stocks, in general, but even precious metal, pricing is at or near record highs. And so it's not evenly distributed. But when you step back or outside of whatever industry you happen to be in and look at, just the abundance or a lot of the opportunity that's out there, there's certainly cause for optimism. And yet when, we have some acute pain point, whatever it is, it's easy to think how terrible, the world or my life is when, in fact, you may not, I don't know if anybody would be interested in this, but I've been listening to Les Mis just like on audiobook, and it's just interesting to see how, or kind of conceptualize how people lived 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, pre-electricity, pre-industrial revolution. I mean, it's just a battle to survive for most folks, and at some level it kind of feels like that today. But I've got heated and cooled car and a home and office, and I mean, I like the standard of living, and then the quality of healthcare and all of those sorts of things are way better than it was several hundred years ago.
Yeah, Jeff, I do think that indirectly kind of correlates with the topics of this podcast, not today, but just the general theme which we're talking about, and largely interest rates lead to a housing affordability, and that there's like a gathering or council meeting with the president that we'll be talking about today, looking at housing policy initiatives to maybe make housing more accessible to folks, and the shelter and whatever else is out there. There was an article long one that I read and was kind of circulating over the last couple of weeks, and it was talking about maybe the Zoomer or Gen Z generations that are just maybe giving up. We've talked a little bit about like investment. The first investment is in like stocks is moving earlier in age, while the first home is moving way later in age, right? And this, maybe that's symbolizing or signifying a change in belief or philosophy for the younger generations here. And this article was kind of trying to highlight, I think, quite dramatic and overstated to some degree, but like they're not able, you can't have the same job for 30 years and get a really nice house and just, make out great with an on-time retirement and your kids taken care of in the same way today that you could back then. And then people are sort of giving up on that, plus kind of measuring themselves and where they are and what they have access to by social media, where you see the best of the most exciting people only, and just sort of losing all hope. And so people are getting excited about these, young people, which I've seen, getting excited about these Kalshi markets, the better markets, and stocks being sort of a thought about gambling, almost on trying to make it big because the 5-iron in the middle of the fairway is just not good enough or exciting or promised or whatever. And I think a lot of this, to some degree, that is there. And how much is it inaccessible versus how much is it no longer satisfying? I think the beginning of this article that struck me as you were talking about your Les Mis references is that, the article started with, hey, when that job for 30 years working on the assembly line in an industrial plant fed you and your family, and that was in question back then. And so that was a perfectly acceptable goal, and you were willing to settle for that sort of thing. But now that's a given, and that's no longer the acceptable or that minimum level of excelling or providing isn't good. That's a sad state of affairs. It felt like a justification for gambling or swinging big and the risking it all sort of thing. So I don't know, just a lot of thoughts on the American psyche in these younger generations, but which leads to home buying decisions one way or another.
Well, it definitely impacts the market. It's been interesting to realize or see some of the data that you referenced, as far as the average age of the first-time home buyer versus the first-time investor in stocks and that sort of thing. And there's just so much of human psychology and human nature that goes into, markets, the way that they react. I mean, there's definitely this hive or herd mentality, when things are good, they're everybody's perception is they're good, and when they're bad, everybody's perception is they're bad. And I think we've seen that in like the run up in current like stock and equities pricing right now. I've seen articles talking about how price to earnings, or meaning how expensive a stock is relative to its income, or like the profitability of the company. are really high. Meaning people are paying a premium, to own stocks right now. And once there's this change in mindset, we saw this in the great financial crisis with real estate. Once the mindset changes of values are going down, this is a negative asset to hold. This herd mentality just really tends to exaggerate the runs in market pricing, for real estate as well as for stocks when you've had big stock market drops as well. And it's just the psychology. I think it's human nature at some level to be stretching for whatever the next thing is that you don't have and would like to. I've got food stability, I've got shelter stability. Well, I want retirement stability. Well, I want maybe additional or whatever next level luxuries are. It is just really interesting to see that play out, and then what impacts that it has across the American psyche, like you say, and how it starts to impact behaviors within the markets, because it definitely does. And we've seen a real shift from get the job, work the life cycle, have the retirement, that's just, and I think there's multiple reasons for it. I think some of it is a mindset shift. I think some of it is companies have a hard time being viable for long enough to provide that longevity of employment. There's a lot of things, that lead into it, but really interesting to observe, Mark.
Yeah, every which way, Jeff. It really is. And I think I've talked about for sure on this podcast, this somewhat cruel experiment that federal monetary policy for the last 30 years has set us on course for, that we're now living through. What sort of changes? How do we get out of this? What is getting out of this look like? I'm not sure that returning back to an 80s and 90s outlook should be the expectation. What mean are you regressing to? I think it's probably a new mean, one way or another. And so we don't know where this thing shifts. And there's just so much change. And I only think the rate of change is going to be increasing with artificial intelligence, which we talked a lot about. So, yeah. But today, I think the topic, Jeff, is housing policy, interest rates, expectations for 2026. And just as we're recording this, we have this true inflation graphic that this is certainly not the Bureau of Labor Statistics or whoever is putting out the CPI, the official government CPI looks here. But a group that a lot of people look at that monitors this and has seen inflation drop below 2%, both on, I think, general CPI and PCE. So both of these things are below 2%. That, of course, is the number that the Fed said they were looking to get to before they could make any major policy shifts. And certainly notice, so the latest CPI numbers we got from what I think is the Bureau of Labor Statistics was 2.7%. So this is meaningfully lower. We didn't get that long ago, Jeff. So this is about the same track. But this trueflation metric definitely has not been under 2% until today, over the last many years. So I think it's meaningful and a sign that inflation is not running rampant as some probability roadmaps say that it might.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, as you were talking, Mark, I just looked up and the next CPI report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is scheduled to be released on January 13th. So in about 2 weeks, we'll have an additional data point to see when or what their read is on inflation data. The Fed meets at the end of January, so there will be a couple of these data points before then. But man, any encouraging sign like this is just certainly welcome news from what we've been reading of this persistent, hard to tame, not where we want it, inflation reading numbers. There's still some question about what the labor market looks like and jobs, and those are the two mandates that the Fed focuses on, is full employment and price stability. I hope that this isn't just an outlier or a one-off, and that it actually is an early indicator of inflation really getting down to where we want it, because I think certainly that's good news for everybody. But one of the reasons that it's good news is with stability, I think, comes better interest rates and more activity in the market that's healthy and sustainable. And it's this uncertainty around, Fed interest rate policy, inflation, tariffs and foreign exchange, policies. That uncertainty just locks everything up. It makes people way less likely to make decisions, hiring and investment decisions than when we are in a more predictable and more stable track.
Yeah. The tariffs have set us on this course. If I was going to say maybe unnecessarily, I don't know if that's the right statement or not, but certainly voluntarily, like we entered into this tariff stuff, and so it's created all of this. It's been a really difficult year for the real estate professional in 2025. And, there are so many currents that affect interest rates one way or another, Jeff, and they all intertwine because the 10-year treasury essentially feeds mortgage rates, and the 10-year treasury is moving one directionally based on the expectation of stability or lack of certainty, or in moving higher when there is a lot of uncertainty. And it's like every week there's some new piece of information. Inflation dropping. Well, that's a big uncertain future that everyone is contending with. But you've got a lot of this fraud stuff that's being highlighted right now. It looks like it's real. I don't know if it is or not, but it looks like it might be real. And Chamath Palihapitiya, who we follow closely, was saying, man, the municipal bond market is getting hammered on this. Nobody wants to be holding the bag in municipal bonds if there have been a lot of waste and fraud and things that are going on with that. And I think that's true of a lot of bonds that are tied to American economic success one way or another. Great that we might be on a course to find it and root it out, but we're dealing with the acknowledgement that some might exist. And there's going to be maybe some nasty, uncertain times while you work through doing something about it, or even worse, deciding that you're not going to do anything about it, And so, boy, we could see higher rates here. And it's interesting, Jeff, because a lot of the predictors of interest rates, Mortgage Bankers Association, Fannie, Freddie, really don't see sub 5% rates in 2026. And I think, this kind of uncertainty, I think we're going to get a lower Fed funds rate at some point this year, like meaningfully lower. We've gotten meaningfully lower Fed funds rates, and that hasn't really moved the mortgage rate nearly as much. And, who's to say this fiscal dominance issue that we talked about last episode is like, well, the Fed policy has sort of lost control of mortgage rates because of the economic uncertainty that exists.
Yeah, Mark, it's an interesting point because we've talked recently about this historic spread between the Fed funds rate, the 10-year treasury, and then the 30-year fixed rate mortgage interest rate. And there are interesting dynamics in the relationship with how those interact, but just because one goes down doesn't mean that the others automatically do. We've seen and lived that. So it means to me that there is the potential, if we get inflation and other like economic indicators kind of in line with where they want there to be, that there's the possibility for the mortgage rate to compress or get lower, even with the current Fed funds interest rate or target rate range. I think there's reason, or at least some hope for optimism, that rates that we care about, which impact mortgage lending, could get better and stay better into the new year. But a lot of it's going to depend on what the read on the economy, from a broader perspective is, and is it where everybody's expecting it or not.
Yeah, man. I certainly know what I want to predict, Jeff. And it's not that I don't think it's going to happen. And I think it is just a truly hands up in the air. I don't know. I think there's good arguments or currents for a lot of different things taking place that are very opposite of one another. We just continue to be within this cruel experiment that we just haven't lived through before. And we're seeing the market react in just saying, yeah, I'm checking out of this. I don't know. I won't buy a house. Never had one before. I can survive that. Rents are down. Or I'm in this house. I didn't expect to be here very long, but it's better than paying, getting a 7% rate or 6.5% rate on a much higher priced home, with a much bigger loan. So I don't know, man. I really don't know what to expect here. And if you read, Housing Wire had a really good article posted last week or so. It was describing 2025, and it was kind of the housing market nationally slowly resetting and normalizing. We've been in a very abnormal situation since COVID, And really, even before that, we had very low inventory and very much a seller's market. The story, it's hard to remember back then. It feels so long ago, but the story then was you had to have cash to compete with these corporate buyers. Like you couldn't get into a first-time house because you just wasn't enough inventory and it was being gobbled up by cash buyers. And so I think that was a lot of foreign. I think that was a lot of corporate, and that people were competing with. And so I don't know. I'm not sure how you reignite, and this normalization is way slower than everybody would like. But what are the things that are normalizing? Prices coming down slightly, not a lot, but slightly. And I mean, in some markets, South Florida, some are 13% sort of things that we'll talk about in a little bit. But most it's more modest, I think. And so you see prices coming down a little bit. You see inventories rising. The enormous seller's market that existed for a half decade has now shifted at least to middle ground, if not buyer's market. So those are the things that are normalizing to some degree. It's just really low transaction volume, the way I see it. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it is really interesting point. And it's so hard when you're living through the middle of something. It feels like it takes forever. And when you look back, 10 or 20 years, what happened. And so it's easy to forget the perspective of, yeah, there was the great financial crisis, but it took years for that pricing to adjust and change, the way that it did. In addition to the trends that you cited, Mark, I saw an article this morning that talked about, not significant, but also like median wages trending up a little bit as well. And so it's kind of this, coming together of any home price softening, any wage increases, any like give in interest rates help address the affordability issue and unlock people who have been reluctant to, give up their 2 or 3% interest rate. And so, but it feels like you're turning the Titanic, and it's turning slowly. It's probably going the right direction, but I think there's still a lot of room, still to go, between any combination of these three kind of pegs of the stool of housing affordability, between interest rate, price level, and an income level for people. And so, I'm with you. I mean, it's like I don't know what to expect in 2026. I hope that a convergence of those things, at least going the right direction, leads to higher transaction volumes. I did see a projection from Fannie that they're expecting, a higher mortgage rate volume, higher mortgage volume taking place in 26. And, this converging of these trends, at least going the right direction, would support that, seems like the most probable outcome. Now, will it be at rates that revert back to the historic mean? I don't know. Do we get from 4 to 5 million, mortgages in 2026? I don't know that, but it probably starts to move that direction is my hope.
Yeah. This word normalization that the Housing Wire article used to describe, I'm certainly not the wrong word to use, but I think I take that to mean the less extreme circumstances with the very low inventory and the extreme price appreciation are now less extreme. So I take it to mean that, but to our earlier point on the episode here, like what is normal? And I'm not sure you can describe tomorrow's normal, 2026 is normal, as whatever was normal in 2018, well before COVID and all of that. Do we have different buyer psychologies and meaningfully different where you can really feel, I don't know if it's a squeeze, but pressures in different areas?
I think it's a really good point. I talked to an appraiser probably in 2015, who had built a spec home, was thinking about, should I move into it and keep it, but was worried that because there had been some price recovery at that point, the values kind of hit rock bottom around 2011. So it wasn't drastic, but there had been a 4 or 5 year run up in pricing. And he was saying, I think, I'm afraid that it's going to drop again. And so he sold and, wishes that he had held on to, whatever he was in it at, at that price 10 years ago. But I think you just make a really good point that, whatever normal was 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there are just a lot of economic factors that today didn't exist, 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that will probably be true into 2026 and beyond. I think that things are moving in a generally positive direction. And so this, kind of away from the real extremes one way or the other, definition of normalization makes sense to me. I think that is a pretty likely place to expect things to land in 2026. But it's just we don't often live in the past, like in real granular level. But when I stop and think about time points, historically, I kind of forget the perspective of what the mentality was and what was going on at that time. And there's always pressures, one way or the other, whether it's up or down on pricing, on the number of transactions taking place in the market, and all of those sorts of things.
The saying goes that real estate will take you into a recession and real estate will take you out of it, meaning it's often like the first to act and move in these directions. And I think Trump administration talking housing is like talking point A. I feel like for the last several weeks, even in that little 15-minute speech that he gave in addressing the country on TV, it was, hey, the most aggressive housing policy initiatives in American history in January are going to be unleashed. And as we're recording this, senior cabinet members, my understanding, Scott Turner, the head of HUD, Bill Pulte, who we talked about, the head of FHFA, Howard Lutnick, Commerce Secretary, and then Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, are huddling up in Florida right now, trying to put together whatever policies will be the most aggressive in American history, with the goal of reigniting transaction activity. And I think their thought is, well, real estate can take us out of this lull that we've been in. In the economy's doing pretty good, I think, from a macro perspective, surprisingly. But boy, it's a winners and losers sort of scenario. And I think this housing initiative and their thoughts are that we've got to help the folks that aren't winning a lot right now. And so as they're meeting, Jeff, we talk about this stuff a lot. It's not really, there's not easy guarantees, at least with as far as my imagination can take us in terms of policy initiatives. Do you have any thoughts on what they ought to be doing to reignite transaction activity and get people mobile again?
It's a really good question. I'm glad you asked, because I was just thinking about that as you were kind of describing, them meeting. What I think we observe generally happens in these scenarios is when the government wants to stimulate something, it usually is policy on the demand side. I would expect what will come out of this are ways to get people money, ways to try to make money more affordable, meaning, impacts on interest rates, and that sort of thing, which would fine. But as we've talked about in the past, Mark, if all you're doing is throwing more money at the problem, it just makes the affordability a bigger challenge. And we talked about, but seen that in healthcare, we've seen that in, higher education. So I would expect that a lot of the policies are going to be around, how do we make things more affordable? Meaning, how do we get more money to people so that they can spend more money on housing? What I think really needs to happen, and I don't exactly know what the granular policy level decisions need to be, but the challenge is if you can address the supply side, meaning put some level of pressure on local zoning municipalities to allow for zoning that will allow for supply to be built. If you can address costs, and one of the challenges with the tariffs is it costs more to import lumber or every other building material. It's hard to break through, those ceilings of price levels to, address the cost to bring on the new supply of housing stock. But, to the extent that they can address the cost of construction and the availability of new inventory, I think that could go a long ways. Now, it may need to be a combination of both, demand stimulus as well as, supply kind of facilitation of bringing online. But it's got to be both of those things to really work. I'm pretty sure it was Ed Pinto, when we had a conversation with him, that made the comment that's kind of stuck with me, that the government's good at stimulating demand, which essentially just means throwing more money at the problem. I'm hoping that they have more comprehensive and effective solutions coming out of it, but my guess at a minimum is you'll see that kind of policy come out of it. But I hope it's more holistic than that.
As I see it, Jeff, if the goal, and I think the goal is to make home ownership more accessible to folks, and I think it is to reignite the kind of American standard, moving every 5 to 7 years or whatever the typical time frame is as lives change and circumstances change, where people have just really put all of that on pause. And so I think these things are the ultimate goals, because it's just want the economy booming, want people to feel like they're winning, politicians. So, I think there are two problems to address generally as I dissect it. The first being the lock-in effect that we're living in now. You've got an enormous amount of folks that have interest rates at 3% or less. And it is clear that they would rather stay in the homes that they're currently in than give up that for a new house with a likely higher price, not just because it's a move up, but because it's price appreciation, and don't want to give up the 3% rate and replace it with something that doubles the rate. So we have a huge lock-in effect that you need to address. And then second is those citizens that didn't own a home at the beginning of this interest rate lowering period and price appreciation period are essentially locked out of buying a home. And I think it is a real problem. It's kind of along the lines of this article that I was talking about, where you have people just giving up on this. There is certainly some sentiment that, look, I rent for a lot less. Like, it is so expensive to get into a house at this point. I literally can't afford it with my income. And so, if you didn't own a home during this asset increase period, you're kind of SOL, because it just appreciated out of your ability to pay. And so I think those are the two things that you've got to address: rate lock-in and access to affordable homes for first-time home buyers. So what policies can be put together to do that? To me, a portable mortgage is about, homeowners, the lock-in essentially means that someone values their loan that they have as an asset. I'm not sure that people have thought about their loans a lot that way. Maybe I'm thinking about it narrowly, but they do feel that is an asset. I don't want to give up this asset and replace it with something liability, the 7% rate or 6.5% rate, also on a bigger loan for a more expensive house. But if they can take that loan with them to the next home and finance the difference, they don't feel dumb for giving up this asset in making that move. And I think that could be a meaningful increase. Now, to your point, if the government wants to just throw money at the problem, which I really fear, I certainly hope that isn't going to happen. But if that is a solution, maybe that asset, there is some money for turning in that asset or giving up on it, closing it out or paying it off or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how on earth those sorts of subsidies would work, but I think that is a way to address the lock-in. Home affordability, we've talked about 50-year mortgage rates a little bit here. I think the entire world hates it, certainly hates it as a symbol of, more debt is not how you solve problems. I don't disagree with any of that, but it does get someone into home ownership for less, marginally less. I don't think somebody's carrying a 50-year loan for the life of the 50-year loan. I think it's almost like an interest loan, for a short period of time. But I don't, so I think that can do it, but it's just so marginal of an impact. You go from a $3,000 a month mortgage to a $2,850 mortgage. That didn't really move the needle, Jeff. And so, I think very creative financing is all that I could think about. First-time home buyer programs. My imagination can't take me into that. I got no idea what those things would be, but I just don't know how you address the home affordability problem without hammering the asset values of homes. And Trump has talked about not wanting, or to be mindful of, the net worth that people have built in their homes. I don't know how you do both. So, building more homes, yeah, maybe. I mean, we've been building a lot more in a lot of these southern markets that are cheaper. It was working for a while, but they're not selling those either right now. So I don't know. That it's a long-winded thought in dissection of the problems to solve here and what could be put together.
Yeah, but I think that you're striking on the reality that there just aren't simple, obvious solutions sitting out there that people could be choosing and just simply aren't. There's this convergence of historic factors that have led us to where we're at today, and I just don't think there's an easy button to push that just solves the affordability and the lockout effect. I do kind of like, Mark, the lock in effect. Referring to those that have these way below market interest rates currently, and the lockout effect of those that would like to buy a home but can't. I'll go ahead and credit you with coining the lock-in, lockout effect terminology. That resonates because I think you do have people on both sides of that aisle. I saw a headline just recently that said that the average time that people have to save to buy for for their first time home purchase is like 7 years. It just kind of putting a point on the reality that there is a lockout effect because of how expensive the home price level is. It's a real needle to thread, with helping those that are locked out currently find a way in that isn't just stimulating more demand and higher price levels, which further locks people out. If the net effect is home price appreciation, significantly. But if your policies significantly devalue, home asset prices currently, politically, that's a major problem, for people already. You talk about a depression or a recession in the real estate market, and that's not a politically popular thing to live through. So it's just, I think, the reality that there's not a simple solution. I have no doubt they will come out with, bold things to try. We'll be watching, interestingly, to see what those are and, what the net effect is. But it's a tough challenge to try to take on, I think.
I am extremely optimistic in the sense that people are talking about it. Decision makers, policymakers are talking about it. It feels like the last 3 years, Powell's probably the one that speaks on it the most, but it's like, hey, look, yeah, just suck it up. You're taking one for the team here, real estate industry. We're bringing your industry to a halt, and it's good for the country. You just got to take it. And feel like we've been living that for quite some time. And I think all of us can feel that sacrifice that are in real estate professions. And boy, these different frauds and wastes and everything that you see over there that are costing the country money. It makes you feel like what are you sacrificing for on some level? There is a frustration that I feel. Should any of the things that are being found be the case?
Yeah, I think you make a good point there in that, the extent of Powell's comments has been, well, house home pricing isn't our mandate. Like, we're not focused on that. And sorry if you're collateral damage. Well, yeah, so is everybody in the real estate space that is doing far fewer transactions than they used to. At least to have policymakers taking a concerted, intentional approach to trying to address the problems. I'm with you. I think there's some optimism to be had in that. And I just hope that the outcome is what's desired. So often when you try to do things, there are unintended consequences, from a top-down approach. And I hope that can be avoided. I know there are thoughtful people involved in the process. And, I hope that it has the net positive impact, for both people on the, on that side of the equation, whether you're locked in or locked out of home ownership in the moment. I hope that it can be a positive, or at least trending that way, as we go into 26. And I think there's a reasonable chance that it will be.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, it definitely could be worse. What the Babylon Bee article saying that, we are living in the absolute peak of human civilization. I think that is true. Boy, I sent you a note on that this morning, but watched the Thinking Game documentary on Prime with DeepMind's kind of creation and their protein folding discoveries and all, just kind of highlighting that. And there's so much rapid development right now on the AI front in this changing world that we're living in. Interesting times, indeed, and how that affects us all the way through. I don't know.
I don't either. I do look forward to watching that documentary, though, Mark. It's just so hard to stay up with like the cutting edge, technology and evolution. But there is definitely reason for hope, and optimism. I think going forward, generally, I felt like things were going to be bumpy as we find whatever this normalization is, and I think that is still going to be the case and is still true. But there are definitely green shoots of optimism and reasons for hope, in addition to the just the challenges that that we are living and have been living for some time. And so, I because things have been hard, I don't want us to like come across as just negative of things suck and they've always sucked and they're always going to suck. And so that's really not my my outlook or perspective. But it's also tempered with the reality that things have been historically challenging in the real estate space, at least as overall volumes are concerned.
You bet, Jeff. I'll be anxiously awaiting here, anxiously looking forward to our predictions episode and looking at what we thought would happen just a mere 6 months ago and how on or off we might be about each of those things. And it's been a fun year for the Market Moves podcast. Appreciate being on this journey with you and the listeners, and really fun to be nominated for the Buzzy Award, and appreciate that. And I think voting closes today, so been fun all the way through, and looking forward to a fun 2026.
Amen to that. It's going to be too late by the time this actually hits anybody to encourage them to go vote. So if you did, we greatly appreciate it. I'm grateful for the nomination in the first place, one way or the other. So looking forward to what's to come. But with you, Mark, it's been a lot of fun. People always ask about the podcast, and one thing I consistently tell them is it just forces us to pay attention to what's happening in the markets, things directly related to the real estate market and kind of tangentially related. But it's challenged us to be more knowledgeable and involved than I would have been otherwise. You probably would have had it figured all out with or without me, but it's been a valuable journey. So I greatly appreciate it and look forward to what 26 has to hold.
All righty. Till next time. Well, till next year, Jeff.
Till next year. Absolutely. Thanks, Mark.